Hello everyone, welcome to Bitcoin Not Crypto. You can find me on Twitter X at ForrestHodl. And in today's video, I'm going to be going over the recent updates of the IMF deal with El Salvador and their current Bitcoin situation as it stands now, as the news kind of comes in. I'm also going to give an update for those of you who don't know. I'm a filmmaker by trade, and I've been in pre-production for a film called The Land of Volcanoes and Bitcoin. I've also been crowdfunding this on Geyser, and it was supposed to be about El Salvador. I'll also be doing an update on that and where I stand with that film and where I'm actually going to be going with it. So all of that to come. But first, I want to tell you guys about where I buy my Bitcoin. If you're looking to get yourself some Bitcoin, the best possible way, in my opinion, is through the Bitcoin Well. It's a self-custodial exchange, which means that when you send them money, they send you Bitcoin directly. They never hold your Bitcoin for you in the form of an IOU. They have the lowest spreads in the US and Canada, no fees. They have non-KYC options. And if you use my link in the description, you can actually get yourself some free Bitcoin. Right here, I have my Geyser fund up on screen, my video here talking about this film idea. And I'm actually going to be doing something completely different with this film. So you can see here, I had a $6K budget. I've reached $278 of that. So I'm well under reaching that budget. And if you actually read all of this, you can see that my goal with this film was to use this as a pilot, basically, to fund a series. And the series would be called Bitcoin Fixes This. And the series would explore different key issues that around the world that Bitcoin could solve, right? This would be, grid balancing, renewable energy adoption with Bitcoin miners, helping the unbanked around the world as a savings technology, where we have to instead invest in the casino of markets or try to store our value in housing. And the idea would be each episode would focus on how Bitcoin would solve, or is solving, or could solve in the future, that specific issue. Now, what I've decided to do is, because of the recent scenario with El Salvador, which I will get into, I've got some really good information about that. I'm actually going to pivot the way that I make these films. So instead of starting with the El Salvador one, I'm going to allow a lot more time to play out and see what happens in El Salvador with their Bitcoin situation. And in the meantime, I'm actually going to be using this $278 and my time and energy and start working on this Bitcoin Fixes This series. And maybe this film will end up happening still, but it will be further down the line as the story develops. If I had made this film, prior to this IMF stuff, a lot of things would be left out, and it would have painted a very rosy picture of Bitcoin adoption potentially, which was never my idea. I was never intentionally going to skew the story in any direction, but without the information, it would have probably naturally have been maybe rosier than it would be now if I make this film now with some of the Bitcoin adoption stuff getting rolled back. Or at least on the government side getting rolled back. If I made the film now, it would create a picture of maybe Bitcoin not working at this nation state level to some degree as far as El Salvador goes. And if I wait longer, I will just have a clearer image, and this will be part of the story. So that's why I'm not rushing to make this film. There's some folks out there that really want to see this film. I've talked about making this film in 2025. So unfortunately, there's a lot of things with documentary filmmaking that is outside of your control. And I have decided, it's been a thought of mine for a while, but I have decided to put this specific film on hold and to focus on the other Bitcoin films instead. Now, if you're a contributor to this is the contributor board here. Just a few thousand sats by the majority of people. Joseph Kane, very generous here, 129,000 sats. And then I actually won a portion of a film grant through Geyser and Orange Pill app. If any of you that have donated to this film, I don't want to make it seem like I'm trying to accept your sats under false pretenses. As I said, documentary stuff changes, things are out of my hands. However, if any of you on here that are also watchers, and I'm going to post as well, I'll write a post. If any of you want a refund, 100% you will get your refund, because I don't plan on making this film when I said I was going to make this film. So I know it's only a few dollars or a few thousand sats for the majority of the people that contributed. However, that is totally on the table for anyone that wants a refund, that feels like I'm not creating what I set out to create, because of the timeline of it getting created and me going in a different direction with my filmmaking in the meantime. Now, let's get into actually what happened here in El Salvador. And John Dennehy, who I've had on my podcast, unfortunately, it was like a day before the IMF deal got announced to the public, so we didn't discuss this. He's been covering this extremely well. He runs My First Bitcoin, which is a grassroots Bitcoin adoption and education in El Salvador and around the world. It's an open source project with a lot of boots on the ground in El Salvador. He's been covering this story extensively. So a great follow if you want to keep up with this. And he reposted this post by Bitcoin News that I'm going to read out. It's a thread. And I'm going to cover my thoughts on it as well. So the Bitcoin News here says, the harsh reality of the El Salvador IMF deal. El Salvador's 1.4 billion IMF deal, I thought it was 1.3, 1.4, reveals a nation in deep debt and in dire straits economically. So this is something that we did not think was happening, right? We saw some, there was maybe the idea of a surplus. The government was paying everyone's water and electricity bill 1 month. But we can see here public debt hit 87% of GDP in 2024. The country sought IMF aid to avoid default. So because they cannot print their own currency, they have very limited options in dealing with a rising debt. They either have to tax their citizens higher, or they have to raise debt, and they have to their GDP could grow and their tax receipts could grow because of that. But if it was staying stagnant or wasn't growing fast enough for the amount of debt they're taking on, then they start to get into a precarious situation. If they had their own central bank and their own currency, they would have a third option, which would be debasing their currency and stealing from the savers, which is what a lot of nations around the world do. So number 2 here, Bukele's security transformation and Bitcoin adoption fueled the belief of an economy boom in El Salvador. The reality, GDP growth averaged just 2.8% over 5 years, with 2025 projected lower. Extreme poverty has nearly doubled since 2019 to 8.8% in 2023. So not as good of a situation as we are all led to believe, that's for sure. El Salvador's debt surged 52% from 2019 to 2024, nearly matching the US's 57% rise. So the US has actually raised more debt, but like I said, they have more options to deal with their debt. Not good options, but they do have options. Its debt jumped from 21 billion to 32 billion, with bond buybacks like the 1.7 billion in April 2024. When this was announced as a something that they were doing with again, it was kind of assumed. It wasn't necessarily as clear, but it seemed like it was like, hey, we're buying back our bonds, no problem. We can do this, no problem. We don't need anybody. We are solvent. We are good. We are buying back our bonds because we can. But when they bought back those bonds, they refinanced them at higher rates than and then repaid, masking the crisis, right? So they actually just added to that debt. They bought those bonds back, but then they added more bonds, right? More debt at a higher interest rate. So it's actually made the situation worse. El Salvador resisted the IMF for years, but had no choice in 2024. This is how the Bitcoin News phrases it. With a 4.4% GDP deficit and a 1.5 billion in annual interest payments, it needed external help to stay afloat. However, this came with heavy costs in terms of its Bitcoin program. So part of the IMF it was really curious of, okay, why were they taking this IMF deal if everything seemed good? And this is making a lot of sense now that we kind of see behind the curtains with these numbers, and we see that things weren't so good. And this is why they allowed the IMF deal to make so many changes to these Bitcoin laws, because the Bitcoin treasury strategy that they've done has actually performed really well and has outpaced a lot of the debt. So that's one kind of bright side to their Bitcoin adoption. But as we can see, it's not enough to outweigh a nation's problems, right? So to secure the 1.4 billion, El Salvador had to end Bitcoin's legal tender status, halt new Bitcoin purchases by the government, shut down their Chivo wallet, which I heard was a disaster anyway, disclose all government Bitcoin wallets and holdings. So there's speculation now that some of the transfers to the doxed public wallet that we see on Twitter is actually just transferring from other government wallets and not necessarily buying, as they maybe have run out of money or they're not allowed to anymore, right? So, and then stop government-sponsored Bitcoin mining. So they had an initiative, right? This is why I wanted to call the movie "The Land of Volcanoes and Bitcoin," is because they had this initiative of using volcanic energy with geothermal to harness that geothermal energy and mine Bitcoin at the location of these volcanoes and geothermal hotspots, and that was government sponsored. So it wasn't necessarily private entities harnessing that energy and using it for mining. Number 6 here, what happened to El Salvador's current stack of 6,100 Bitcoin? El Salvador can keep its existing Bitcoin but can't buy more since holdings don't threaten fiscal stability. The IMF deal doesn't require selling. At a 500 million valuation, it still pales in comparison to the $32 billion debt. So even though it's significant, right? 6,100 Bitcoin, that's great. I mean, as a nation, it's a decent stack, right? It's $500 million stack, but their debt load is just too severe for this to be that significant, right? I mean, if you just look at it percentage-wise, it's crazy. $500 million compared to $32 billion of debt. Number 7 here, El Salvador's fiscal crisis predates Bukele. Of course it does. This nation has not been doing well for a long time. Bukele has turned around a lot of things. He's made it a lot safer, but you can see there's this domino effect from the past, and right, there's the piper needs to be paid at a certain time, and how much can somebody do within 4 years, right? It's actually looked like a lot of the metrics have increasingly got worse, actually, and this could be just a fact of the situation getting worse, right? So decades of mismanagement left the country vulnerable. While Bukele has made major reforms, rising debt became unsustainable, forcing an IMF deal. Despite the IMF deal, Bitcoin in El Salvador continues to grow. Top education initiatives, My First Bitcoin, Node Nation SV, and Cubo Plus, thriving circular economies at Bitcoin Beach and Bitcoin Berlin SV. Major players like Tether and Rumble are setting up in the country as well. So not all is lost as far as the Bitcoin front, right? And this is why I'm putting a pause to this filming, because I don't think it would be necessarily, I think I need to tell this story in the final film, but this isn't where I want to do the vast majority of production on this film. So that's why I'm waiting to see what else happens here. We can actually see this is released by the El Salvadorian government as part of the 111 page report that the IMF released. And he's underlined here, importantly, as per agreement with the IMF, we will no longer accumulate new Bitcoins in our portfolio. So we can see here that stair-stepping 1 Bitcoin a day, occasional 10 Bitcoin a day into the government's treasury is going to stop at some point. And this is going to happen fairly soon. This is the way they can kind of stop them from doing this is by withholding this debt that they're giving them. they get a certain amount now, they get a certain amount throughout this period, and then they can get more depending on if everything, if they're doing everything properly with the deal, right? And then they refinance, they create new deals, all of this, and all of that is in jeopardy if they break any of the agreements that is in this 111-page deal with the IMF. So El Salvador is really in between a rock and a hard place. I think they've done a lot of great things as a nation. Bukele has done really well. He is, in my eyes, still the first Bitcoin president. Of course, he was dealt a very horrible hand. Bitcoin was not enough to save that hand. It was not the river he needed. It was not the whatever the other things in poker are. That he was dealt a 2 and a 7, right? So he needed a lot of help. Bitcoin was maybe another 2, but somebody had, the rest of the world maybe holding a pair of aces, right? So the analogy here is really running away with me, as my knowledge of poker is very slim. But this is, it's a development here. I think it's interesting to see how this will progress. And again, this will be something that I'm going to be keeping a close eye on, because this film is still in pre-production. As I meet more people, as this story develops more, that will allow me to flesh out this story, to create the content, and to make a documentary eventually. And prior to that, of course, I will focus on the Bitcoin Fixes This documentary series, which I can do a lot more local. There's some people that I'm talking about with at-home heaters and different things like that, and I will probably focus a lot on the mining side of utilizing renewable energy, producing heat, and participating in the Bitcoin network economy. So that's about it. If you guys have any questions, if you have any comments, of course, YouTube's the place for that. Thanks everyone for watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this whole situation. I don't think it's a total failure. I don't think it's a total win. Of course, there's a lot of gray here, and you can point the blame at all sorts of different places, and you can see that the amount of Bitcoin they were able to stack was not enough to offset, even with the amount of gain that they've had in that Bitcoin value, has not been enough to offset the situation that they've been dealt and the situation that they're dealing with in El Salvador. So it's still a place I hope to visit. It's still a film that I hope to make, and we will see all of that unfold in the future.